Marjorie Taylor Greene crumbles as Jasmine Crockett exposes her as Putin's puppet live on air. Have you ever watched a political career shatter in real time? Not from scandal, not from media takedown, but from being completely obliterated by facts and fury live in the halls of Congress. Because that's exactly what happened when Rep. Jasmine Crockett took the floor and without raising her voice utterly dismantled Marjorie Taylor Greene's latest attempt at rewriting reality. It wasn't just a clash of ideologies. It was a collision between delusion and truth, between propaganda and principle, and the aftermath left Greene exposed, outmatched, and frankly humiliated. You see, Greene didn't just step in it. She dove headfirst into a narrative crafted straight out of the Kremlin's playbook, resurrecting discredited claims about Nazis in Ukraine, cherry-picking headlines from years-old Time and NBC articles, and parading them as proof that U.S. support for Ukraine was aiding white supremacists. She painted a picture so bleak, so distorted, it might as well have been written by Russian state media. And just when it seemed no one on that committee would call it out for what it was, a grotesque distortion, a national security risk, a lie, Crockett rose. But let's rewind. Because to understand the magnitude of what happened, you need to see the buildup. The hearing was intended to address international threats, national security, and foreign interference. But Greene, ever the chaos agent, hijacked the moment. Her opening salvo wasn't about China or border policy or even cybersecurity. No, her target was Ukraine. And more specifically, her aim was to dismantle public support for Ukraine by injecting the term Nazis into the conversation, like a smoke bomb, hoping to cloud the issue in confusion, paranoia, and selective outrage. She waved printed articles, made dramatic claims, cited FBI Director Christopher Wray wildly out of context, and declared with all the confidence of someone who thinks Facebook memes are peer-reviewed journals that America is funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But here's the thing, those articles, they're real. But so is the context she left out. Time and NBC both ran pieces highlighting the complicated presence of the Azov battalion in Ukraine years ago, before Russia's full-scale invasion, before global alignment against Putin's war crimes, and long before Ukraine became the front line of the global fight against autocracy. Those articles weren't endorsements of a Kremlin narrative. They were warnings about extremist groups and how democracies must confront them. But Greene weaponized them as if they were bombshell exposés buried by the deep state. She didn't stop there. She pivoted hard into right-wing grievance territory, ranting about Biden's open border policies, Chinese migrants, the IRS tax day, and how struggling Americans are footing the bill for wars overseas, while nothing is being done at home. It was classic Marjorie, a word, salad of xenophobia, deflection, and manufactured rage. And just when she thought she had delivered her mic drop, the mic got ripped from her hand. Enter Rep. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't scream, she didn't interrupt. She waited and then delivered one of the most cutting surgical dismantlings Congress has witnessed in years. First, she reminded the chamber who was in power in 2019 when Ukraine was first blackmailed for political gain, Donald Trump. The very man Greene worships had threatened to withhold military aid from Ukraine unless they investigated his political opponents. That alone should have ended any Republican credibility on Ukraine, but Crockett wasn't done. Then she brought receipts, literal ones. She held up Greene's own tweet in which Greene falsely suggested that Hamas used U.S. weapons and called on the U.S. to track serial numbers. It was blatant misinformation, quickly debunked, but Greene never deleted it. Why? Because for her, truth is negotiable. Fear, on the other hand, is always useful. Crockett turned to the witness, Dr. Timothy Snyder, and asked bluntly, was that tweet propaganda? His answer, yes. Straight from the Russian disinformation and playbook. What followed wasn't just a rebuttal. It was an indictment not just of Greene's rhetoric, but of what it represents, a rot within our political system, where elected officials spread enemy propaganda from within the halls of power. Crockett didn't stop there. She reminded the room and the country that if we're going to talk about neo-Nazis, we don't need to look to Ukraine. We need only look back to January 6th, when white supremacists, Proud Boys, and literal neo-Nazis stormed the Capitol. Some of them are now imprisoned. Some are still being called patriots by Greene and her allies. In a moment of pure clarity, Crockett entered into the congressional record a headline that read, Neo-Nazi, January 6th. Rioter pleads guilty. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Greene warns about hypothetical Nazis in Ukraine while defending or excusing the ones in her own backyard. Let that sink in. This wasn't just a political debate. It was a moral reckoning, and it was Jasmine Crockett who stood on the side of facts, of accountability, and of the American people. And Greene. She was left with nothing but her printouts and a gavel cutting her off. But the real moment, the shift in the room, the gasp you could practically hear through the screen, came when Crockett called out the hypocrisy, plain and simple. We have people in this chamber that are actually causing just as much a threat, if not more, to our own country. That line didn't just pierce Greene's narrative, it obliterated it. Because she wasn't just talking about one congresswoman. She was talking about a pattern, a deliberate strategic erosion of truth for political gain. Crockett's message was clear. If you're echoing propaganda, if you're amplifying lies, if you're turning Congress into a megaphone for authoritarian talking points, then you are the threat. And as she yielded back her time, calm and resolute, the damage was done. This wasn't just a bad day for Greene. This was the day Jasmine Crockett showed America what real patriotism looks like. And we're only getting started, because what happened in that hearing wasn't just about a single exchange. It pulled back the curtain on something far more dangerous, an entire propaganda pipeline, one that runs from Moscow to Marjorie, from Kremlin, talking points to congressional microphones. And behind the spectacle, behind the outbursts and the highlighter-marked printouts lies a strategy, one designed to erode, trust confuse facts, and stall America's commitment to democracy abroad. Let's talk about that strategy. Let's talk about the myth of Nazis in Ukraine. If you've followed global affairs, or if you've spent 5 minutes in a conspiracy-laden corner of social media, you've probably seen some version of this claim that Ukraine's military is infested with neo-Nazis, that the US is arming fascists, that somehow Vladimir Putin is actually liberating Ukraine. It sounds absurd, right? That's because it is. But absurdity has never stopped a disinformation campaign. In fact, the more outrageous it sounds, the more effective it becomes, especially when it's repeated by people in power. The origin of this narrative traces back long before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In 2014, following Ukraine's pro-democracy Euromaidan revolution, Russia launched a military occupation of Crimea and began backing separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. To justify this aggression, Putin's regime painted the new Ukrainian government as overrun by Nazis, despite the fact that far-right parties earned less than 2% of the national vote in the following elections. But propaganda doesn't need facts. It just needs amplifiers. Enter the Azov Battalion, a small military unit formed to resist Russian aggression. In 2014, Azov was known for attracting some far-right extremists in its early days. It's true that a handful of members had ultranationalist ties. That's not a conspiracy, it's documented. But here's the part that Greene and her ilk conveniently omit. Azov was absorbed into Ukraine's National Guard, its extremist elements marginalized, and it has since functioned under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, not as a rogue militia, but as part of Ukraine's official defense apparatus. Still, Russia seized on Azov as their narrative centerpiece. We are denazifying Ukraine, Putin declared in 2022, justifying a full-scale invasion that would kill tens of thousands and displace millions. And now, in 2024, American lawmakers like Greene are echoing that same justification. Let that sink in. They are taking Kremlin propaganda, dressing it up in American flags, and feeding it back to the public as if it's truth the mainstream media won't tell you. But here's what they don't want you to see. That Ukraine's Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, lost family members in the Holocaust. That Ukraine is fighting for its right to exist, not for ideological purity, but for sovereignty. That the real threat isn't coming from Ukrainian Nazis, but from Russian forces committing war crimes, bombing maternity wards, and kidnapping children. And most importantly, that U.S. support for Ukraine is not about funding Nazis. It's about defending democracy against authoritarian expansion. So why does Greene keep repeating these lies? Because it works. Because the moment she says neo-Nazis in Ukraine, it does two things. One, it activates far-right fear narratives that are already primed in her base. Two, it casts doubt on America's foreign policy, weakening public support for continued aid to Ukraine. It's not just dishonest, it's strategic, and Jasmine Crockett saw right through it. When Crockett called out Greene for echoing Russian propaganda, she wasn't just scoring political points. She was identifying a pattern of subversion, one that uses half-truths, viral tweets, and faux outrage to muddy the waters of public opinion. Because this isn't the first time we've seen this movie. We saw it when Greene suggested that U.S. weapons were somehow ending up in the hands of Hamas, a claim not backed by evidence, a claim refuted by intelligence officials, but a claim that once tweeted lives forever in the disinformation ecosystem. And here's the truly chilling part. Greene's tweets aren't just misguided, they're amplified by known disinformation actors, Russian state media, far-right influencers, conspiracy blogs. They all pick up on her sound bites, recycle them, and pump them back into the bloodstream of American discourse. This isn't free speech. It's informational sabotage. And yet, when challenged, Greene wraps herself in the flag and dares anyone to question her patriotism. She claims she's just asking questions. But what kind of patriot echoes the same lines used to justify the bombing of civilians? What kind of lawmaker spreads lies that undermine American allies and empower foreign adversaries? That's the part Crockett zeroed in on. She didn't just dismantle Greene's claims. She exposed the rot underneath a brand of politics that thrives on misinformation, fear, and deflection. A politics that would rather protect an ideology than protect the truth. And that's where this becomes bigger than Greene, because she's not the only one. This tactic, resurrecting fringe narratives, misquoting sources, cherry-picking headlines from years ago, has become standard operating procedure for an entire faction of the Republican Party. A faction that sees chaos as currency and the truth as optional. Think about it. Instead of rallying bipartisan support to secure the border, this faction torpedoes immigration bills just so they can campaign on the problem. Instead of supporting aid for allies fighting off authoritarian regimes, they muddy the waters with phrases like endless war and globalist agendas. And instead of working to inform their constituents, they flood them with confusing, contradicting, emotionally charged content designed to keep them angry, distracted, and afraid. That's not representation. That's manipulation. But the hearing wasn't all bleak, because for every Greene there was a Crockett, and her message was simple. You want to talk about neo-Nazis? Let's start with the ones who stormed this building on January 6th, the ones waving Confederate flags and wearing swastikas, the ones Greene called patriots, the ones who beat police officers and tried to stop a democratic transfer of power. Crockett reminded the chamber that those are the extremists posing an actual threat to American democracy, and that if Congress won't call them out, the American people must. This is what makes Jasmine Crockett's voice so vital, not just because she speaks truth to power, but because she refuses to let disinformation fester unchallenged. She understands that in today's media landscape, silence is complicity, and that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is call out the liars loudly, publicly, and relentlessly. In the next chapter, we'll look even deeper into the disinformation economy that fuels this machine. Because Greene isn't acting alone, and the lies she spreads don't end in a tweet. They are part of a well-oiled narrative designed to infect every corner of American politics. And unless we understand how it works, we risk letting the lie win. In the last chapter, we exposed how Greene's rhetoric is not a mistake, it's a strategy. A strategy rooted in deliberate disinformation, designed to sow confusion, erode trust, and paralyze our democracy. But Greene isn't alone. She's a megaphone, one of many, amplifying a well-oiled disinformation economy, where lies are profitable, outrage is currency, and truth is the first casualty. This is not a glitch in the system. This is the system now, for the MAGA-fueled far-right truth isn't just irrelevant, it's a threat. So, today we go deeper. We pull back the curtain on the machine behind Marjorie Taylor Greene's talking points, the interconnected web of media outlets, think tanks, influencers, bots, trolls, and dark money groups who all benefit from the chaos she creates. Because Greene didn't wake up one day with the idea to quote Kremlin narratives about Ukraine. That message was seeded, nurtured, and fed to her like fertilizer for fanaticism. Let's start with the media. And no, we're not talking about Fox News anymore. We're talking about the post-Fox ecosystem, an unholy alliance of far-right streaming networks, YouTube grifters, Telegram channels, and pseudo-journalist outlets that blur the line between reporting and rage-baiting. Think of names like OAN Newsmax, Bannon's War Room Gateway Pundit. These platforms don't just report stories, they manufacture narratives. They take slivers of truth, drape them in distortion, and blast them to millions who've been trained to distrust any source that doesn't confirm their worldview. And when Greene parrots those lines in Congress, she's not doing it by accident. She's feeding that beast and being fed by it. Let's take one example, the claim that American weapons ended up in Hamas's hands. That talking point started on a Telegram channel linked to Russian state actors, was echoed by anonymous Twitter accounts, then picked up by obscure websites notorious for spreading pro-Kremlin content. Within 48 hours, it was trending in right-wing media. Within 72, it was in Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweets. And the moment it left her mouth, it gained legitimacy. Not because it was true, but because it was said by someone with a congressional pin. This is how disinformation spreads today. Not from top-down propaganda machines, but from distributed chaos networks fueled by clicks, driven by fear, and legitimized by those in power. But here's the catch. None of it works unless people like Greene keep repeating it. Because lies don't travel far without hosts. So, Why do they keep doing it? Because it works. Because every time Greene says something outrageous, it dominates the news cycle. It crowds out real debate. It shifts focus from policy to performance. And it forces Democrats like Jasmine Crockett to spend precious time debunking nonsense instead of solving problems. That's not a flaw in her strategy. That is the strategy. And meanwhile, voters are left drowning in contradiction. Is Ukraine full of Nazis? Are we actually helping terrorists? Is Biden ignoring the border? It's exhausting, and that's the point. The more overwhelmed you are, the easier it is to disengage. And when you disengage, they win. But here's where things get even more dangerous, because this isn't just about controlling narratives, it's about controlling what people believe is even real. We now live in an age of choose-your-own reality, and the far right is exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. Deepfakes, fake screenshots, misleading headlines, misquoted statistics. All of it is designed to fracture the very idea of shared truth. And it's working. According to a recent poll, over 40% of Republican voters now believe the war in Ukraine is a deep state operation. Nearly a third believe the U.S. is funding Nazis. These aren't fringe beliefs anymore, they're mainstream in MAGA circles. And politicians like Greene are capitalizing on it, not correcting it. But it's not just Greene. We're seeing this tactic everywhere, from J.D. Vance's smirking dismissals of authoritarianism to Matt Gaetz's efforts to defund the DOJ to Donald Trump himself, who refers to his criminal indictments as witch hunts and calls January 6th rioters hostages. The goal isn't to convince everyone of a single lie. The goal is to convince everyone that the truth doesn't exist. And in that vacuum, power wins. The loudest voice wins. The most outrageous claim wins. But what happens when truth is no longer the foundation of policy? What happens when conspiracy becomes currency? We get paralysis. Just look at the border crisis. Greene stood in that hearing and screamed about how nothing is being done to protect the border. But what she didn't say, that her own party killed the bipartisan Senate border deal, a deal that would have provided billions for border security, increased personnel, and upgraded infrastructure. Why did they kill it? Because solving the problem would rob them of a talking point. Because keeping the border chaotic gives them something to campaign on. It gives them fear to sell outrage to manufacture and immigrants to blame. And that's far more useful to the MAGA machine than actual solutions. So when Greene says the border is the biggest threat to America, she's not wrong. But she's part of the reason it's a threat. Because while Democrats and even Senate Republicans worked toward compromise, House MAGA extremists burned it all down and then acted like they were the victims. This is the cycle. Manufacture a crisis. Block the solution. Blame your opponents for the crisis you created. Repeat. And all the while, Americans suffer. Communities suffer. Truth suffers. Unless someone stands up and says, no more. And that's what Jasmine Crockett did. She didn't just fact-check Greene. She exposed the entire machine, how a lie gets born, dressed up in patriotism, and weaponized by bad faith actors who care more about power than principle. She reminded the country that truth still matters, that facts still matter, that if we don't draw the line now, we risk letting disinformation become the default setting of American politics. So, the next time you hear a claim that sounds just a little too perfect, a little too convenient, ask, who benefits if I believe this? And if the answer leads you to a tweet from Marjorie Taylor Greene, backed by a Telegram account traced to St. Petersburg, amplified by bots and echoed in congressional chambers, then maybe you've found the real threat to American democracy. Because when Jasmine Crockett took the mic, she didn't just push back on Marjorie Taylor Greene. She flipped the script. She turned the hearing from a circus of conspiracies into a courtroom of accountability. And in doing so, she put not only Greene, but every lawmaker spreading disinformation on trial. Let's return to the hearing room, the air still thick with tension. Greene had just finished her latest tirade, waving articles like proof-spewing statistics with no context, throwing around phrases like Ukrainian Nazis and foreign lobbyists. Her voice rising, her tone accusatory, her narrative deliberate. The American people are being lied to, she proclaimed, and for once, she was right. But the liar was her, so Crockett stood. Calm, controlled, no theatrics, no volume, just purpose. Her words were quiet, but they echoed like a gavel. Mr. Chairman, one of the things my colleague did not inquire about, but I want to make sure we're clear on, is that Trump was president in 2019 when he threatened to withhold aid to Ukraine. Boom. Just like that, Crockett cracked the illusion wide open. While Greene tried to paint Democrats as reckless for supporting Ukraine, Crockett reminded the chamber of the real betrayal the moment Donald Trump held military aid hostage to extort a political favor. That wasn't theory, that was fact. Documented, impeached over, and yet conveniently erased from Greene's outraged timeline. But Crockett didn't stop there. She turned directly to Dr. Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian and expert on Eastern European authoritarianism, who had been listening patiently. And she asked him not about military tactics or fiscal policy, but about truth. Dr. Snyder, I may be going out on a limb, but are you aware that this idea that U.S. weapons were used by Hamas is actually just propaganda? Snyder's response was clinical, devastating in its simplicity. Yes, what you have is a typical example of American-Russian messaging, where the implicit idea is that we shouldn't give weapons to Ukraine because they're going to end up somewhere else. There's no evidence for that. There it was. In one breath, Crockett had forced Congress to reckon with something no one else dared say out loud, that propaganda wasn't just coming from abroad, it was coming from within, and it wasn't subtle. Because the tweet Crockett referred to wasn't some old post buried in the archives. It was Marjorie Taylor Greene's own tweet live, on her timeline still up, still viral. In it, Greene called for serial number tracking on U.S. weapons supposedly used by Hamas, a claim that had already been debunked by U.S. intelligence defense officials and Israeli sources. So, why was it still there? Because Greene doesn't delete lies. She depends on them, and Crockett knew it. She pressed further, not just against the tweet, but the ecosystem that allowed it to flourish. It is a problem. When you have people who sit in positions of power with a $2 million budget and they don't call on staff to fact-check what they post. Instead, they spread propaganda because it fits their rhetoric. The room shifted. It was no longer about defending Ukraine. It was about defending reality. And then Crockett dropped the hammer. You want to talk about neo-Nazis? You can find them right here in the United States. With surgical precision, she turned the entire Nazi narrative back on its creators. She referenced January 6th. She reminded the committee that many of the same lawmakers decrying extremism abroad had excused, enabled, or outright celebrated the far-right insurrectionists who tried to overturn an election. She even entered into the record a news headline that left the chamber stunned: neo-Nazi January 6th. Rioter pleads guilty. No deflection, no denial, just fact. Staring everyone in the face. And that was Crockett's genius. She didn't argue on Greene's terms. She reframed the battlefield entirely. While Greene tried to paint Ukraine as the problem, Crockett revealed that the real threat isn't 5,000 miles away. It's sitting in Congress, wearing an American flag pin, tweeting propaganda, and sabotaging our democratic institutions from within. Because this isn't about Ukraine. It's about accountability. It's about who we choose to believe, and more importantly, who we allow to lie without consequence. Crockett made that choice crystal clear, and in doing so, she challenged more than Greene. She challenged the entire Republican caucus, who stood silently by, who watched as misinformation took root, who knew better but said nothing. If we don't hold our own accountable, if we let lies spread because they're politically convenient, we are complicit. That line. That wasn't rhetoric. That was a warning. Because the greatest danger to America isn't foreign propaganda. It's when that propaganda is embraced by the very people sworn to defend us from it. And here's where Crockett's brilliance truly shone. Even as Greene tried to pivot to immigration tax day, the CCP and the budget, Crockett brought it back to results, to action, to solutions Republicans blocked and then blamed Democrats for. She reminded the country that the only reason border legislation failed was because House Republicans killed it. A bipartisan, hard-fought Senate bill torched not because it was bad policy, but because it didn't serve the chaos narrative. And as she closed her remarks, Crockett wasn't pleading. She wasn't even angry. She was focused. The Democrats are ready. The Senate Republicans seem ready. The only people standing in the way are the ones peddling Putin's lies. Silence. That's the moment the air left the room. Because Crockett had done what few politicians manage in these hearings. She told the truth without flinching. No sugarcoating, no partisan gymnastics, just a piercing indictment of hypocrisy, cowardice, and willful deception. In that moment, it wasn't just Marjorie Taylor Greene who was on trial. It was a whole system of distraction and distortion that's infected our politics, and Crockett exposed it all. But the story's not over, because while one voice can cut through the noise, it takes a movement to shut the machine down. Jasmine Crockett showed us the power of that one voice, the clarity, the courage, the precision. But even she knows that confronting a machinery of lies, this vast, this embedded, this profitable, requires more than truth spoken once. It requires truth repeated, organized, and mobilized. Because the disinformation machine doesn't clock out when the hearing ends. It adapts, it pivots, it shifts narratives like a chameleon. If it fails to rile people up over Ukraine, it will move to the southern border. If that doesn't land, it'll talk about crime in cities, drag shows in schools, COVID conspiracies, or Marxist math in classrooms. The topics may change, but the strategy stays the same. Create fear, distort facts, and always blame Democrats. And what makes it so dangerous is that it works. Not because it's smart, but because it's loud, relentless, coordinated, and most importantly, it's profitable. Let's be clear, disinformation is a billion-dollar business now. Entire platforms exist not to inform, but to inflame. Not to solve problems, but to sell outrage. And MAGA Republicans have turned it into their primary policy tool. Think of it like this. If you can't pass legislation, lie about what your opponents are doing. If you can't govern, pretend the government itself is illegitimate. If you have no plan, sell fear as if it's the plan. This strategy isn't confined to Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's everywhere, and it's being applied to every major issue that affects American families. Let's start with immigration. Just days after Greene ranted about the border during the Ukraine hearing, her allies were back on social media, claiming the Biden administration was letting in terrorists and selling out America. What they didn't say, what they never say, is that their party had the chance to pass the toughest bipartisan border security bill in years negotiated in good faith in the Senate, and they torpedoed it. Why? Because Donald Trump told them to. Because chaos at the border helps him campaign. And just like that, the playbook reappears. Or nisim. Best 1. Manufacture a crisis. 2. Block the solution. 3. Blame your opponents for the problem. 4. Fundraise off the fear. Then there's healthcare. How many times have you heard the claim that Democrats want to implement government death panels, or take away your doctor, or give free care to illegal immigrants while Americans suffer? It's always the same script designed to pit communities against one another. What they don't mention is that Democrats are the ones pushing to cap insulin costs, expand Medicaid, and protect coverage for pre-existing conditions. Meanwhile, Republicans have voted over 70 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act, with no replacement in sight. But instead of owning that, they just shift the narrative. They invent a new outrage, a new enemy, a new lie. And now they're doing it with education. From shouting about woke indoctrination to banning books to targeting LGBTQ+ teachers, the far right has turned classrooms into battlegrounds. They've created a fictional war on parents while slashing funding for public schools and demonizing educators. It's not about protecting kids. It's about controlling narratives, about using schools as pawns in a larger cultural war designed to stir resentment and consolidate power. And through it all, one common thread ties these tactics together: distraction. The more they can distract you with false enemies, the less they have to answer for. Why they won't support paid family leave. Yes, why they won't raise the minimum wage. Why they oppose climate action as the planet burns. Why they're silent as corporate profits soar and working families fall behind. Because if you're busy arguing over whether there's a drag queen reading a book in a library in Michigan, maybe you won't notice that billionaires are dodging taxes while your rent goes up and your healthcare gets slashed. This is the real play. It always has been. And yet, people are waking up. Jasmine Crockett's takedown wasn't just about Marjorie Taylor Greene. It was a blueprint, a signal to the rest of us that disinformation only wins when we stop pushing back. That outrage only controls the narrative when truth stays silent. Because for every lie that spreads online, there's someone who can challenge it. For every outrageous tweet, there's a constituent who can ask a hard question at a town hall. For every bad faith hearing in Congress, there's a voice like Crockett's that can cut through the noise and say, enough. And that's where the movement begins. Not with massive rallies, not with viral hashtags, but with conversations, with questions, with calling out the lie before it takes root. It's a neighbor correcting a conspiracy theory at dinner. It's a teacher calmly explaining how curriculum really works. It's a voter asking a representative, why are you blocking solutions and blaming others? And yes, it's lawmakers like Jasmine Crockett who refuse to let disinformation become the norm, because here's the truth. Democracy doesn't die in a single blow. It dies from 1,000 cuts, each one delivered by a lie, a distraction, a cowardly silence. But every time we fight back, every time someone like Crockett speaks truth into that chamber, every time you speak truth in your own circle, you stitch democracy back together. You remind people that facts still matter, that accountability still matters, that there's a difference between criticism and sabotage, between tough debate and weaponized dishonesty. And let's be honest, There is a war happening, not the one Greene keeps screaming about, but a war on truth, on integrity, on the very idea that facts should guide policy and that governing is about service, not spectacle. So when Crockett looked across the aisle and said, "We have people in this chamber who are actually causing just as much a threat, if not more, to our own country," she wasn't exaggerating. She was diagnosing a national crisis. Because if the halls of Congress become megaphones for authoritarian propaganda, if disinformation becomes the currency of political success, if lies go unchallenged because challenging them is too divisive, then we're not just losing the argument, we're losing the country. But here's the truth. They don't want you to remember we haven't lost it yet. Because for every lie shouted from the House floor, there are millions of Americans who still believe in facts and decency and democracy. And when those Americans find their voice, when they stop scrolling past the disinformation, stop tolerating the noise, and start demanding better, that's when everything changes. That's what this has always been about. It's not just Crockett versus Greene, not just truth versus propaganda. It's us, you versus the erosion of reality itself. We've watched this disinformation ecosystem grow louder, more shameless, more dangerous. We've seen how a single false tweet can move faster than the truth, how performative outrage gets rewarded with airtime, while fact-based policy gets buried under hashtags and rage clicks. And we've seen how Republican leaders, rather than standing up to it, have leaned into it not because they're confused, but because it's easier to rule a misinformed base than to lead an informed one. They don't fear losing control of the narrative. They fear what happens if the people ever get it back. So the question isn't whether disinformation exists. It's whether we're willing to confront it not just with facts, but with force. Not the force of violence or vengeance, but the force of organized truth, the force of collective resistance to lies, the force of an engaged, outraged, truth-hungry public that refuses to be distracted by smoke and mirrors. That starts now, and it starts with you. Because if there's one lesson to take from Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's this: no one is coming to save democracy for us. We save it by showing up, by speaking out, by refusing to let outrage win the news cycle just because the truth takes longer to explain. So, how do we do that? It's not as complicated as they want you to think. It starts with calling out the lies wherever you hear them, not with aggression, but with facts, with questions, with persistence. Because sometimes the most radical act in a disinformation war is refusing to be gaslit. It continues with amplifying the truth, supporting voices like Jasmine Crockett, who are willing to go on record under oath and speak truth even when it's not politically safe. That means donating, sharing, volunteering, and making sure those voices are never drowned out by the volume of lies. It means refusing to disengage, because that's the goal of all this chaos: to make you tired, to make you cynical, to make you believe that all sides lie, that truth doesn't matter, that your voice doesn't count. But it does. It always has. It mattered when young people organized for civil rights in the streets. It mattered when women fought for the right to vote. It mattered when everyday citizens knocked on doors in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and flipped the electoral map with truth and turnout. And it matters now. Because here's the thing: disinformation can't survive accountability. And accountability comes when people vote, when people organize. When they say, you don't get to sit in Congress and spread lies about our allies, our democracy, our communities, and walk away unchallenged. It's easy to look at someone like Greene and think, what's the point? She's never going to change. And that's probably true. But this isn't about changing her. It's about outnumbering her, outvoting her, out-organizing the machine that props her up. It's about making sure that when someone stands up with courage like Jasmine Crockett did, they're not standing alone. Because one voice can cut through the noise. A movement can shut the machine down. But only the people, only you, can turn that moment into momentum. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next chapter. And the question now is simple: are you ready to fight for it?